Let's talk about cellos. This is Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Today we're diving into challenges and tips for cello players. I've worked with quite a few cellists at this point, and I have enough to say about it that it justifies its own video separate from the other main string groups. So, cellos are one of the very few instruments that cannot be played standing. Minor exceptions made for the rock cello players that might come up in like Apocalyptica or something like that. Awesome, but very rare. So I already have a previous video looking at chairs for string players, so definitely go check that out. We're not going to spend too much time on that in this video. So we've got either the pneumatic adjustable height piano benches over there, or we can look at the chair here. So for now we're just going to stick with the chair, but just know that the piano bench and wedge cushions, always good options. What about other logistical things with cello playing? Notice I've got two sets of shoes going on here. I've got my ballet flats and I've got some quite tall heels. For cello players who are on the shorter end, it can actually be really helpful to wear heels. Obviously this is going to be, at least in the US, a very gendered thing of who is going to be comfortable wearing heels, but if you are a person who wears heels, consider trying that with your cello. So one of the reasons for that is in this height of chair, I'm not going to be able to get really good connection with my heels to the ground if my feet are slid back like even the slightest bit back from my knees. So even this is just about right under my knees, with my ankles right under my knees, even just maybe 3-4 inches back from that, my heels are no longer touching the floor. Watch what happens when I put on heels. So these are quite tall. It doesn't have to be this crazy. I have good contact to the floor on both the front and the back of my feet, all the way back to, like a good 6 inches behind my knees. And this is actually more stable and feels more supported to me than in the flats, unless I have my feet like pretty far out in front. So just consider, if you are someone who isn't sure whether playing in heels is allowed or a good idea, let me be the first to tell you, yes, you're allowed and you can try it out and see if that works well for you. Ideally, we want good support underneath the legs. So for a cello, the knees are a major stabilizing factor, and they also need to be able to move. If you're a player who uses a lot of contrary motion going back and forth, this is part of what controls the body of the instrument. So for handling those type of movements, it's really helpful to have good connection to the floor and good grounding. I've worked with some cello players who didn't realize that they were moving their feet as they played, to the point that with one player at one point, he was playing a really difficult piece, this incredible, awesome Hungarian sonata, the Kodály sonata, awesome. And he was moving his feet to the point that at one point, both his feet were off the ground at the same time. And I was like, no, don't do that. You're going to lose your foundation entirely. So if you're someone who struggles with that, or if you've seen that happen, maybe when you didn't realize it, if you saw yourself on video or something for a performance, stick something on top of your feet while you're practicing. That's what I did with this student when we were working on this stuff. We stuck his backpack on top of his foot and then something else on top of the other foot, and that helped him really connect a lot more with the floor. And then his contrary motion from side to side was working a lot with just this tilt while still maintaining connection with the floor. That helped a lot. Other things cello players need to keep an eye on is shoulders in a different way than violin and viola players, right? So when we have the high string instruments sitting up on the shoulder, working with exactly how you're lifting the shoulder or when or why is something that we dug into in the violin viola video. With cello, it's a bit different. So what I see with cello players is a fairly even split of pulling shoulders up or forcing them down. If they do go down, it tends to be in the bow arm on the right, where the whole side of the torso, from pretty much shoulder down to hip, gets crunched. this can come up sometimes if someone has been taught, make sure you don't lift your shoulder, and then they kind of overcompensate and go too far the other direction. It can also come up from trying to get a really stable sound and really using the weight of the arm to get that pressure from the bow to the strings. And so if they're thinking, especially on down bows, if they're really thinking about going with gravity and going down, they might inadvertently go down in the whole torso. So an analogy that I use with cello players a good bit is a similar one that I use for violinists, but for a different reason. 80s shoulder pads. 80s shoulder pads are up and out. This helps with two directions that are very common in Alexander technique, lengthening and widening. So this idea of lengthening is to decompress the spine so that you're not crunching in on yourself and you're also not doing funky bendy things. So just allowing length in a balanced way, front and back. And widening is making sure that you're not compressing yourself in. That might not be just tucking your elbows under. Very few cello players are able to pull that one off. But it might be in the shoulders or in the back. I do see quite a lot of cello players narrowing in their backs. A way that you can experiment with what it would feel like to narrow in your back deliberately is to try to pull your shoulder blades together in the back, or think of that as being trying to pull kind of your waist area, low ribs, trying to pull that back. You'll feel muscles tighten with that, and those are muscles that are very associated with the upper arms. So the lat muscles, latissimus dorsi, goes from the near tailbone, bottom of the torso stack, and it goes in a V up and out and attaches all the way up to the shoulder area, but it's actually on the arm bone on this side, and it attaches along the spine for a lot of the way up and then comes out on both sides to attach to the arms. It's one of the ways that we pull in a rowing motion. If you think about rowboat or like rowing exercise, it's very lats heavy. That's one of the ways and one of the muscles we work to do that. Cellists also have to use that muscle and surrounding muscles in that area in a way that's really well balanced and very deliberate. So as the bow arm moves, even though, yes, you still need to maintain the weight of your arm with gravity against the strings with the bow, not letting that drag your torso down or tighten. So thinking up and out is really helpful for cellists. Another thing to check in with for cello players is how are you lifting your left hand? It's really helpful to look at a skeleton and dig into shoulder anatomy. I've got some videos on that as well if you're not familiar with it. How can you lift your arm from the fingers, thinking about it as the fingers leading up to the neck of the instrument without messing with the shoulder itself? So it's lifting the arm from the fingers without shrugging, but also without pulling the whole thing down, right? It's leaving it alone. Finding your neutral first, being able to look around, right? Here's my standard neutral. This is what I use for just sitting in a chair at all, which I make all my students practice for several weeks first before I give them the additional complicating factor of their instruments. And then the instrument comes to that. And this really doesn't have to change all that much. So sticking with as neutral as possible is going to give you more freedom, less stiffness, and less tiredness because you're not working so hard in order to be in your standard playing position. We're going to turn this sideways, not hit the piano. Good, good. Let's talk about tilting. I highly encourage cellists to get comfortable with tilting. This is where you can get movement in your playing, as far as body movement, without doing it in a way that's unhelpful for you in the instrument. Now, the trick with this is, unlike most other instruments, the thing's connected to the floor, right? So the angle between the instrument and your chest might change a little bit. You kind of form an A frame leaning against each other, just very slightly. As the instrument leans against you, you're also leaning back, and there's good solid connection there. So being able to tilt does mean the whole thing is going to shift. And I do recommend you practice that. It helps you to not lock yourself in place. It helps you to not try to become a statue. And yes, you can absolutely still have a really solid foundation with the chair, with the floor, still going up, right? Lengthening and widening, 80 shoulder pads up and out, and have that be movable. That's really important. It's an instrument. We shouldn't be stuck into place. And anytime that you are holding yourself into one very sturdy, well-defined solo position for long periods of time, you're going to get stuck in it, and it's going to get tiring, and you're running the risk of developing long-term fatigue and strain and pain with that. So this tilt comes from my hip joints. This is where the leg meets the torso, and I'm up and over from that. So notice that my sacrum area here, which is where the spine attaches to the sides of the pelvis, this whole bony area back here does move. It's very slight because it's pretty near the pivot point that we're talking about. But what we're avoiding doing, and why I'm talking about, yes, this needs to move too, is if this base stays still and totally vertical, let's call it a right angle between my torso and my legs, and then I try to tilt above that, it comes from the spine, and we're avoiding doing this. This is a crunch. This crunches me in the front, and it's also going to change the height of my shoulders compared to the instrument. So this is all sorts of unhelpful. So working with this tilt means that the instrument and I are moving together, and that's a relationship that you can practice and get really consistent with. Another thing that I work on with cellists is while you're doing contrary motion, which is, of course, leaning in the opposite direction of where the bow is traveling in order to get a little bit more motion, the instrument goes with you, right? So you're changing a little bit of the relationship between the bow and the instrument by moving your body, and the connection of the body then transfers to the instrument. While you're doing that, experiment with how much connection with the chair are you still maintaining on the side you're leaning away from. So, for example, on an up bow, if I'm leaning to the right, my left hip area, right, all the way down to the bottom of the pelvis, is coming up off the seat just a little bit. And then the opposite on down bows, especially going way to the end of a down bow. This is when I especially see this, particularly with folks who have very long arms, and they can really go really far to the end of that. They're going to lean really far in their torsos sometimes. You can experiment with, does this help to maintain a little bit more connection and think down towards the chair on the side that you're leaning away from? So it'd be down on this side, down on that side. It might still come up a little bit, but the direction, the thought of thinking down might help you to not crunch it up. And it's this that we're avoiding. I don't ever see students doing this much. I'm just exaggerating it so that it shows on camera. I don't want contrary motion to be a bend at the waist. This is going to cause problems. So maintaining length along this whole thing, length isn't exclusively up. It's both ways. This is decompression and lengthening, and maintaining that ease both ways. So if it's helpful, you can think of this as this like almost disco dance kind of a thing going on, where there's these arrows going away from each other. My upper torso is trending up, and I'm also thinking down on the opposite sit bone. And then when you get that in practice and really kind of figure that out kinesthetically, figure it out in your body, it can be very subtle. And it just helps to maintain that lengthening and decompression while you're playing. So to recap, we're avoiding compressing in on yourself. Lengthening and widening can be really helpful. Thinking of a V shape coming from your low spine all the way up and out your shoulders. Checking that you're not pulling the shoulders back and down and the middle of your back and down and in, letting that widen. Lifting the arms without necessarily needing to lift the shoulders if you don't need to. Practicing your tilt, especially in order to reach higher positions. This is really useful for this. And coming back to, where is my neutral, and how can my relationship with this instrument be as healthy and sustainable and as neutral as possible?